Douglas is back in the news because his image and that of Lincoln hang on both sides of the House chamber in the Illinois state capitol. And there's a discussion now of taking Douglas's portrait down and
Right.
removing his statue from the grounds of the Capitol. So I'd like you, as a historian, as someone who is so well read about all these details, and obviously you know have you're also a person of your own period in time, and you look at these issues like everyone else does. Did Douglas do something where he deserves to hang in the House chamber, or does he deserve to be removed? One, and two. What do you make of this latter-day movement of doing away with pictures, and some would say an effort to erase history, if not rewrite history?
Right. Very good points. To your first point, what I would say is, in the conversation that I think, fortunately, we are having about unequal justice in this country, Douglas should be considered. He did espouse racism. He espoused white supremacy. And those are issues that we no longer believe valid in our country. So I would say he certainly should be looked at from that perspective. On the other hand, as you say, there are nuances in history that had exactly the same things, even in the communities in which he lived. For example, the second president of Illinois College, Julian Sturdivant, which was that abolitionist college in Illinois, the first college in Illinois, believed blacks should be free to do what God prepared them to do, which was to wash our clothes and carry our water. That's a white supremacist statement. So to boil that part of it down, I think Douglas is worthy of examination in the discussion today. And I don't know whether that discussion will say, let's take his picture down or not. But I think Douglas deserves at least the discussion, because it sounds like we're going to take that picture down. The other part of your question was, did he do something that would merit his picture remaining there? What I would point to is he is the man who singularly organized the western half of this continent. Certainly, we need to look at where he came from a cultural standpoint, but there is certainly merit in appreciating a man who built the nation that President Lincoln, over 4 years of bloody war, preserved. I would say, on your question about the discussion we're having about removal of statues and are we removing history, I felt that way until November of last year. And I know the moment it happened to me, when I began to think differently, I heard an African-American woman who pointed out that when she was a child, she was in a car, in the backseat of a car driven by her father, and her mother was with them. Her father was a professor at a university in the South. They were driving up the street in Charlottesville, and she looked and saw statues of, Robert E. Lee and other Confederate generals. And her thought at that moment, this 5-year-old child thought, these are the men who wanted to make me a slave. That hit me just at the right moment, in the right way, to say that, they were great generals and certainly deserve historic recognition. But I agree, I have come to agree with others that their statues should be placed in locations where context can be given to them. My view of the context was that they were traitors to their country. Robert E. Lee was educated by American taxpayers at West Point. What he learned to become a great general, he learned there. He was an engineer. Taxpayers throughout the country paid for his schooling. He went south. He left his nation, and he killed his fellow citizens. So that should be explained, in my estimation. It's not a destruction of history. It should be explained properly. And a statue that can put fear and intimidation in the heart of a child is not a proper way to display a man who was a traitor to his country, who sought to enslave human beings.
I suppose part of this conversation that we are having as a society is, does a statue denote honor? I mean, certainly in a lot of cases that I think is the intention.
Sure.
And it would be hard to argue, I think, at least from my standpoint, uh, why do we honor, if that's the right word, those who fought against the United States as Confederate soldiers? On the other hand, the other side of that argument, or at least one part of it, there's more than A and B in this argument, I think. The other is, to what extent do we diminish our national awareness when we tend to erase those awareness of who were people? And in part, that's why I think we want to be doing this interview on Stephen Douglas. It is, we don't do this interview necessarily to honor Douglas, to say that everything he believed in was correct, but that there were certain people along the path of history, good and bad. Adolf Hitler was an historical figure. We don't honor him at all, but by the same token, we damage ourselves if we don't know who he was, what he did, and the impact he had on the world. To
Yes.
that end, and Hitler is the extreme, I worry about the fact that we have this rush to judgment, that we are applying standards of our time to historical figures and then saying they were all bad when they weren't necessarily all bad. There was, like so many of us, none of us are saints and all of us are sinners. And then I suppose it all depends to what extent do we emphasize what impact did any of us have through the course of our life on the world as we transpired through it. So that's how I kind of see this debate, and I just worry about, are we damaging our national awareness of history and who the players were by this effort to say, well, we're going to remove these statues. Maybe we should. But then you also see, and I think a great historical illiteracy, which unfortunately plagues the nation, where you have people tearing down the statues of Grant, who one would argue Lincoln could not have freed the slaves were it not for President Grant. So why don't you give us a little bit of your thoughts?
Yeah, my thought very simply is that we should not erase history. We should know about General Lee, and we should know about Alexander Stephens. We should know about the three men who planned the secession starting in 1856, and it came to fruition. So we should know those subjects, but we should know the truth of those subjects. What I would say from your discussion of the overall picture is that, President Lincoln conducted a tremendous war to try to preserve the Union, and that's the way it started. Douglas introduced amendments to make slavery to appeal to the slave states to stay in the Union. Congressman Corwin introduced two amendments which would have made slavery permanent in this country, and the second, make it unamendable, which means only by revolution again could that have been ended. That actually had gone to the states, and Illinois was one of the states that voted in its behalf. And President Lincoln in his inaugural talked about, he understood that was at the time moving through Congress, and he supported the idea of trying to hold the Union together. Anti-slavery or emancipation occurred as Lincoln continued to grow during the war, and the Emancipation Proclamation came January 1st of 1863. But here's what I would say as an overall part of this. Abraham Lincoln prosecuted that war successfully. He was assassinated on Good Friday, April 15th of 1865, and resurrected in every pulpit in the nation on Easter Sunday, 2 days later. Really, and I believe if we have a saint in our country, a civil saint, it is Abraham Lincoln. I love Lincoln. He's the guy I started with and the guy I will finish with. But if there is a good and bad, and there is in politics just as in religion, there's a yin and a yang. President Lincoln was the good, and the man he pursued for 26 years unsuccessfully, Stephen Douglas, ends up being the bad in history. That's just the way we kind of look at it. Was he really that bad? I let people make their own judgments. One of the great pieces of misinformation in history is whether or not he did own slaves. In fact, much of the discussion that goes on right now is whether he owned slaves. And what I can report to you is that he, in fact, did not own slaves. He is said to have owned a slave plantation in Mississippi, 900 acres, operated by 123 slaves, with 30 more slaves on the way when the actual owner died, who was his father-in-law. His father-in-law, Robert Martin, the day after Douglas married Martha Denny Martin in April of 1847, told Douglas he was going to give him that plantation. Douglas told Martin, that's not the kind of property a Northern man cares to own, and Douglas did not accept. He declined the property. A couple of years later, when Robert Martin died, his will left the plantation to his daughter, Douglas's wife, with the understanding that she would operate the plantation herself. The way he phrased it, she would sell it if she had no children. She would sell it, and then the proceeds would be used to return the slaves to Africa, and they would take with them any proceeds left over after that expense. Douglas did not own slaves. His wife owned a plantation. They did have 2 children, and that plantation then went to the 2 children. Douglas, however, did not own slaves. To his discredit, he accepted income during his lifetime from that plantation for so-called management. It's pretty clear that he really had very little to do with the management of the plantation, but his father-in-law did, in his will, leave Douglas 20% of the income of the plantation. Douglas, I understand, did take it, and that certainly is not to his credit that he benefited then from slavery. My judgment is he had flaws. Mr. Lincoln used the N-word twice in Ottawa. Should that erase him from history? Certainly not. That's the nature of who people were in that time. So you're right. We need to look at the history of that time, in the period of that time, and the way people were in that time. And Douglas lived in the same time.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.